In this video, you're going to learn about the Harris family from Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Everything from their background, to their motives, to their happy ending. Hi, my name is Jeremy, and welcome to Elwyn Studios. The Harris family has its roots in Kentucky. It has 3 members. George, a young man who was separated from his family when he was a boy. His current master, also referred to as Mr. Harris, had sent George to work at a bagging factory. Out of the watch of his master, George taught himself to read and write, but he couldn't get much more education beyond that. Eliza is George's wife. She is the personal slave of Mrs. Shelby on a plantation near the factory. Eliza was bought by Mr. Shelby at a very young age and knows little of her past, unlike George, who remembers being separated from his family all too well. Harry is George and Eliza's only child. He's about 4 years old and lives with his mother on the Shelby plantation. Because both Eliza and George are part white, you almost mistake Harry for being completely white, except for the fact that he has his father's deep dark eyes and his mother's long dark curly hair. Our story begins in the house of the Shelby plantation. In the parlor sit Mr. Shelby and a slave trader named Mr. Haley. Mr. Shelby had fallen into debt and is now trying to settle his account by selling our main character, Uncle Tom. But Mr. Haley says it's not enough. In walks little Harry Harris. Mr. Shelby shows off the boy's charm and he gets Harry to do little tricks and dances. But Eliza soon enters and takes Harry out. Seeing Eliza, Mr. Haley offers to buy her to balance Mr. Shelby's debt. But knowing how much his wife is fond of Eliza, Mr. Shelby refuses. But the debt still needs to be settled. So Mr. Haley offers to buy Harry instead. Believing he has no other choice, Mr. Shelby signs the papers, and Harry is now the property of a slave trader. We now turn to George. Even without a formal education, he's one of the hardest working in the factory that he's at. He knows the ins and outs of the business, he can run all the machinery, and Mr. Wilson, his employer, even considers him a sort of right-hand man. George is doing so well, in fact, that his master comes to check on him. George shows his master around, giving him the grand tour and even showing off an invention that he built to help with production. George is pretty proud of his work and happy that his employer finds him an integral part of the factory. But his master is bothered. George's master is not like some of the other masters of Kentucky. He's very self-conscious, self-centered, and often beating his slaves for the smallest things against him. He despises how well masters like Mr. Shelby treat their slaves, and he was against the marriage of Eliza and George. All this to say, seeing George in a favorable position, well-read, and carrying himself like a man, this master feels inferior to his thriving slave, and he intends to change that thought. All of a sudden, George finds that he no longer has a job, and his master takes him back to the plantation, where neither George or his employer can say a thing. And seeing the way his master treats him, that doesn't look like George will ever be able to have an enjoyable job or to work at the factory ever again. In fact, George is sent on an errand that takes him past the Shelby plantation. George suspects that his master wants him to tell his wife about all his troubles, so that the family worries. But George has a better plan. He's gonna go tell his wife that he plans to run away. Of course, Eliza's initial reaction is one of fear, shock, and a lot of confusion. But after George explains how bad things really are, she knows he has no other choice. Here's a list of some of the things that George's master has done to push him to this extreme. George has been put to the hardest work on his plantation. He's been beaten regularly by his master for the littlest things. George's only companion, a dog that Eliza had gifted him, was killed by his master. George, of course, was beaten because he wouldn't kill the animal himself. But worst of all, George was to marry another girl on his plantation. And if he refused, he would be sold in a slave market in New Orleans, just like he remembered some of his family members had been 10 years earlier. With all this going on, Eliza now sees that George's only option is to make it to Canada and earn enough money to buy his family's freedom. After her husband leaves, Eliza becomes anxious about Harry's safety, now remembering the stranger that was talking to Mr. Shelby about him earlier. She doesn't know who Mr. Haley is or what his business is, but she overhears an argument between Mr. and Mrs. Shelby about Harry being sold. Eliza's situation has quickly become more desperate than even George's. So she packs her things, takes her son, and runs north. All night she runs, and by the evening of the next day, she's in the free state of Ohio. This might sound easy enough, but remember, Mr. Haley would have been chasing her and Harry as soon as he found out they were missing. Eliza would have to cross the half-frozen Ohio River in the winter at night, and she would have to do all of this carrying Harry and enough clothes and food for both of them. There are two important factors to consider when thinking about how she accomplished this task. The first is Mrs. Shelby. The moment she heard Eliza was on the run, she did everything in her power to keep Haley off her trail. A little accident with the horses, a few of the slaves guiding the hunter to dead ends and through rough terrain, and of course, someone to warn Eliza of her pursuers. The second factor in Eliza's escape is her resolve. She just watched her husband leave on a journey which would probably mean freedom or death for him. She had also already lost 2 children at infancy. Harry is her only surviving son, and she was not about to have him also taken away from her. Our story now requires us to look back to George, or more specifically, George's former employer, Mr. Wilson. He had just finished work and is now sitting in a bar near the factory where he notices an ad on the wall. It's a description of George and a reward for his return, dead or alive. Then, just like an old western, a strange, mysterious man walks into the bar. It's a young Spanish gentleman, well-dressed and obviously new to the area. But Mr. Wilson finds this stranger just a tad familiar. Then he realizes it's George in disguise. Now, Mr. Wilson is an honorable man and does not betray George's identity, but he does try to convince George to turn himself in. He points out that it's illegal for a slave to run away from his master, no matter how bad. But Mr. Wilson is also a simple man. He doesn't understand the evils of slavery, but George does. And George has no trouble sharing his thoughts with his former employer. George tells of how when he was just a boy, his first master got into debt, and George watched as each of his siblings was sold to a strange man. Then it came his turn, and for a while, he was glad because his new master had also bought Emily, one of his sisters. But it would all have been better if he was sold apart. George's new master beat Emily often for being a Christian. She was eventually sent to New Orleans, and George heard nothing from her since. For 10 long years, George endured his master's cruelty, until finally he was hired out to Mr. Wilson, who treated him well, encouraged him to work hard, learn to read, write, and do business. He met his wife, had a son, and was happy for a time. But what would all it mean in the end if his master could take him once again from the only kind people in his life? George could not be convinced of anything now. He had only to gain his freedom or die in the attempt. We switch once again back to Eliza. Having crossed into the Free States, she was taken to the house of a senator who lived near the Ohio River. The family is reluctant and skeptical at first, but after questioning her, they feel it is their duty to do all they can to help her. She and Harry are given fresh food, fresh clothes, and then taken to the home of a nearby abolitionist, who had sent her along her way on the Underground Railroad. Why she had to hurry on her trip to Canada was because Mr. Haley had hired several well-known slave hunters. On top of that, there was a new fugitive slave law that announced that anyone who helped a runaway slave could be arrested, Free State or not. The irony of the whole thing is that the senator who was helping Eliza had just voted in favor of the law that day. But after hearing Eliza's story, he was convinced of his mistake. Both Eliza and George are helped along the Underground Railroad for some weeks. Their paths finally unite at the home of the Halliday family. They are a group of Quakers in a Quaker town. This means there are more abolitionists than not, and so they are safe for the time being. But George hears of the slave catchers and becomes even more desperate now that it is within his power to protect his wife and his son. The Harris family is soon on the run once again, this time with an experienced woodsman from the area who's taking them by wagon to the next town. But as anticipated, the slave hunters and a few hired men catch up. A fight ensues, but since the Harrises have a guide who knew the area, they had the advantage, and the slave hunters gave up the chase. They are now within a day's journey to freedom. It's a boat ride across Lake Erie. They know if they're to be caught, even on the edge of Canada, they would lose everything. Disguises are made for Eliza and Harry. She is to be a teenage boy, and Harry a little girl. George also covers up the brand his master put on his hand, and they all go to the boats. George recognizes a man there as one of the slave hunters that they had fought the other day, but he's not recognized. The Harris family gets aboard the boat, and within hours land in Canada, free. Both parents finally rest after weeks of worrying and a lifetime of bondage. And George, for the first time, feels like he can thank God for his goodness to him, because he is now free. But our story doesn't end here. 5 years later, George has a successful apprenticeship, Eliza has another child, and Harry is getting the education his father always wanted for himself and for his son. But wait, there's more. One day, they receive a few unexpected visitors. It's George's sister, Emily, and Eliza's mother, Cassie. Emily had been married and freed, but when her husband died, she inherited a lot of money. Now, George really did get that education, and it was funded for him, and Eliza and the children were taken care of for the rest of their lives. As for Cassie, Eliza's mother, well, we'll talk about her story another time. If you learned something new from this video, you can click here for more brain-stimulating stuff, and over here somewhere to subscribe to stay up to date on all we got going on.